Hello, I'm Tim Griffin, and I'm the Director of Urban Design at the St. Paul Riverfront Corporation. I'm going to be talking today about the idea of land use for the Boards and Commissions Leadership Institute, and really bringing my experience as an architect and city planner um, uh, over time, but more specifically working in St. Paul since 2001. Much of what I'm going to talk about regarding land use is a reflection of our conversations around the downtown area in the early 2000s, and then most recently, in the last 5 years or so, doing the framework planning and stationary planning for the Green Line, the Central Corridor LRT, and also the Great River Passage. So this session is on land use, and it's a presentation to the Boards and Commissions Leadership Institute in November of 2014 as part of an overall program for that group. I'm going to talk about land use um, and the role of you all in that civic process. So the presentation has been organized into three parts. I'm going to spend a little time talking about just definitions around land use and how that fits into the civic conversation. Then we'll spend some time talking about the application of the process and what that means, using both St. Paul and other examples. And then finally, we're going to talk about the participation or the involvement in the different opportunities that folks have, both technically and as community members to participate. So land use is the human use of land. It's how land has been organized, and it's not to be confused with zoning, which is a regulatory technique to control land use. Now, obviously, historically, over time, pre-Western settlement, land was used organically and naturally. And what has happened with that notion is that when settlement occurred and land was ownership was taken away, the landscape began to change and evolve. And here's an early example of just watching that happen in St. Paul, which is a river city, and you can see where the steamboats plied the river. It has changed from a forested river valley into this settlement pattern that you see. Land use really came into the conversation of that happened early on in the 20th century on the East Coast, and it really looked at the relationship between manufacturing facilities, where people lived, and also the impacts on public health. So those three items converge to begin talking about what is land use and how could it improve the overall health, actually, both physical health and economic health of a community. This diagram shows the relationship of land use as a topic to its kind of major companion or counterpart, the transportation planning. And I understand you're going to have a conversation about transportation planning at a future session, but you can see here how they relate in terms of kind of conceptual discussion at the top, where you see the local comprehensive planning and the long range transportation planning, and then all the way through project implementation on the bottom. And so these steps that occur in order to create a framework, if you will, for development and public investment to occur, have a series of very specific steps. These apply at scale to what you'll see is the city's community's comprehensive plan. As part of that, there are various chapters. You see again zoning here farther down the path, where it starts to talk about the regulations that translate the goals and policies of a comprehensive plan into actual development, the review process, and then the projects itself. There's also a whole counterpart to this in terms of fiscal budgeting, in terms of how that how that relates. Obviously, you're familiar with the costs associated with roads and transportation projects, the light rail, highways, local streets, et cetera, which are constantly in the news. But also, in terms from the land use side, there's both public and private investment, and this largely contributes to the tax base of the community. And so, all these conversations have implications in terms of when they come to be built, how projects are supported, and perhaps equally importantly, how existing areas of the community are maintained and reinvestment occurs to continue to make the community a viable place to live and work. The land use conversation also is philosophical from a kind of a regional point of view, and it addresses the way in which the intensity of settlement in a city kind of transitions out to the surrounding landscape. In the Twin Cities, the Met Council is an organization that really looks at the relationship of systems and the relationship of land use patterns of various communities. Then they're tied together with the sanitary sewer system as one area of their responsibility, and then the other is the transit system. Looking at the impact of these conversations, there are larger environmental impacts. While we don't have mountains, the sensitivity of the Mississippi River and it's all the way down to the Delta talks about the implications of land use decisions that are made. And land use, while it started in the 19th century, is the forum for conversations probably out into the future, and what kinds of technologies, environmental impacts, social initiatives will be with us at that time, and the land use conversation as a forum to address that. Let's move into the application in terms of what is the process for the conversation, and probably more importantly, what are the various categories. So here we have this idea that land use really can happen at many different scales. It can happen at an international scale, a regional scale, the conversation that I mentioned with the Metropolitan Council and the relationship of all the comprehensive plan, local community comprehensive plans, and then locally for the citywide plan, and then down into neighborhood specific area plans, master plans for new developments or redevelopments, and then individual projects. So it's a lens to look at the way that cities are discussed, envisioned, dreamed, planned, and built. More specifically, land use is a chapter in the comprehensive plan, and cities have the various sections. This diagram is a combination of the different land use categories in St. Paul. They're again reflected here, and I wanted to spend a moment talking about what the typical land uses are, and how the implications, both historical and moving forward in that. You can see the colors associated with the land uses here on the right. The green colors tend to be associated with greenways and parks. Many communities, St. Paul's has a Parks Commission, and they deal specifically with the parklands. Sometimes those are city departments. Continuing kind of from an idea of intensity, if you will, the public open spaces are then supplemented with the kind of institutional uses. St. Paul is a capital city, so we have, not only do we have the typical schools and grade schools, high schools, and so on and so forth in those facilities, but also many government buildings, and also we're the home of many smaller colleges and universities. So a large percentage, if you were to draw a pie chart, St. Paul has a pretty high percentage of uses devoted to institutional and park and open space. The next cluster is how residential neighborhoods are organized around that, and typically neighborhoods are divided into single family neighborhoods around schools and parks that consists of primary single family homes, duplexes, and some apartment developments. And then higher density residential as you get into the downtown area, near the downtown area, and then also along major commercial corridors in St. Paul, like Grand Avenue or University Avenue or Selby Avenue. The red area tends to signalize or indicate concentrations of commercial office use. Again, the downtown area, and then the various corridors. St. Paul, even though we're just building light rail now, actually developed as a streetcar city. So you see the remnants of the old streetcar lines as being the areas where most of the commercial development occurs, and also in Minneapolis as well, and in the first-ring suburbs around the Twin Cities. The downtown itself was adjacent to, and we talked about this in the beginning a little bit in terms of a lot of the industrial uses were clustered near the river in St. Paul, and then out along the along the midway area between Minneapolis and St. Paul. Over time, those have been reverting back to natural and recreational uses as the city reconnects to the river. So that map is really the kind of the square on the right here in terms of this process. And I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about just what the process is to create a land use plan. And you see one of the critical pieces is what is the community input piece. And there are various kind of evaluations of what is meaningful public involvement. But the notion is that the goals and aspirations of the community are part of the information that are gathered. They become part and parcel of the goals, if you will, or the evaluation criteria. And then when the technical city staff and/or consultants creates these responses or alternative responses to the issues, needs, and opportunities facing the community, those values should be part of the evaluation and selection criteria. So you see here on the left, gathering the information, which is both technical and public opinion, kind of a technical process of analyzing the information. What does it mean? What are the trends? What are the metrics? And having conversations with the community about what those implications are, and then bringing forward a variety of ways at solving or addressing those in terms of both based on local values and also national trends and other kinds of initiatives that you can bring to bear. And the outcome is this future land use plan that we've seen in context of the other overall comprehensive planning process, then moving into development, regulation, zoning, real estate development, and then reinvestment policies. So where do you all fit in, or how do you come to the table? You saw in the previous image the relationship of community input, and that can take a lot of different forms, from individual people attending individually at kind of designated points to being much more involved and organized around initiatives. It appears that folks who become passionate enough and committed enough to devote time to this conversation really come out of various city building systems, if you will, and being advocates around those systems. There is the food equity issue, which has organized a lot of conversation. People who care passionately about the water and the environment. There's a strong conversation around living wage jobs, affordable housing, impact of gentrification, environment, art, equity in terms of access to jobs and housing and park systems, and then the development of healthy communities based on both for elderly and the young in the 880 Cities Initiative, and the idea of being able to walk and bike to most of the to meet most of your family and individual needs. And so this is kind of a rich pool for bringing a lot of perspectives to the table. Um, in that conversation, there is the notion that there will always be around land use the idea of NIMBYs and LULUs. NIMBYs are not in my backyard. People who bring that perspective to the table, and this frequently rears itself in conversations around affordable housing projects. You may be familiar with the recent initiative around the Dorothy Day project and the points of view that that brought out. Probably also is frequently talked about in terms of major roadway improvements, transit improvements, and so on and so forth. LULUs are locally undesirable land uses, and these become siting of things like flood walls and dikes, factories, other kinds of incinerators, power plants, and so on and so forth. And there's a real question about those facilities are necessary in communities, and where do they wind up getting placed? What's the criteria for placement, and what is the impact on the surrounding neighborhoods, and what is the voice in terms of how those facilities get sited in an equitable manner. Community organizations are often collaborators on these land use conversations. They are, in Minneapolis and St. Paul, are staffed and have their own governing council and probably have committees on land use, development, transportation, so on and so forth. And so they become an intermediary between the technical planning staff, the city government, and the communities. Staff and members of these organizations have gone on to other roles and responsibilities in the land use conversation. Mayor Chris Coleman was a staff person at the Frogtown Community Development Corporation earlier in his career. And that brings to the point that in terms of the spirit of this Leadership Institute, in terms of investing the time to participate, there is a natural path in terms of opportunities to move into different conversations and different capacities. And it really, starting with from an advocacy point of view, evolving into leadership and community organizations, and then beginning to serve on councils and commission. The City of St. Paul has a planning commission. Frequently, these land use conversations are chaired by a member of the commission and probably a member of the local neighborhood organizations, the district councils. And then obviously the city council itself, and then the leadership in the mayor's office. Land use winds up being a conversation in which a lot of it's social, it's around equity, and it's also very, very political. So the idea of the process and the conversation in terms of, as you can see here in this sort of 10-step progression, which I think is supposed to suggest forming a circle, and it is iterative, and it repeats, and it organizes around the idea of goals, the idea of using those to evaluate alternatives, and then the regulatory pieces to monitor and ensure that those come into are carried out in terms of the spirit and the intent of the vision. And I think as we move forward, there's always a land use map, and I think it's important to remember that when we're talking about land use planning, we're really building communities. And so this idea of density and how this is a technique that's beginning to become more common, where the land use colors are being extruded up to start to represent a community, and you can start to see the texture and the fabric of what's being created, and also be involved in the conversation in terms of which densities are appropriate and what the relationships are that the street and block patterns form and the parks and public spaces spaces for them. So land use is a it's a specific discipline, but I think as you can see, it's very interrelated and interconnected, both from a physical infrastructure point of view, a social capital point of view, and an environmental impact point of view. So that's it. Thank you very much.